Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of negotiations, accountability, law, and diplomacy in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats, lawyers, and prosecutors in negotiating peace and justice. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by my good friend, Professor David Crane, the founding chief prosecutor of the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone and a PILPG Senior Peace Fellow. David, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Paul.
Now, in today's conversation, we will focus on the origins of the Special Court for Sierra Leone and David's integral role in founding the court and serving as its first prosecutor, building what has come to be known as one of the more successful international or hybrid criminal tribunals in modern history. We will dive into David's reflections on the role of justice in building a durable peace. Now, importantly, David served as a chief prosecutor for the Sierra Leone Tribunal from 2002 until 2005, and he is responsible for the indictment of the President of Liberia, Charles Taylor, the first sitting head of state in history to be held accountable for atrocity crimes. David is also the author of Every Living Thing: Facing Down Terrorists, Warlords, and Thugs in West Africa, A Story of Justice, which recounts his time at the tribunal. And we're not done yet with the bio. And David is also co-chair of the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues, which every year brings together current and former prosecutors, judges, and defense counsel to share lessons learned and discuss challenges faced by the ongoing efforts to establish effective mechanisms to hold those responsible who have committed atrocity crimes. Thank you for joining us today, David. I'm so looking forward to this conversation.
I very much am too, and it's a very important topic and very timely as we work our way through seeking justice for Ukraine.
Well, now, David, can you provide us a brief description of the conflict in Sierra Leone? Now, I know this is probably the most difficult question I am going to ask you today. There have been books and movies, and even one starring Leonardo DiCaprio on this topic, but can you try to do this in 3 or 4 minutes for us?
Well, the conflict in West Africa that's centered around Liberia and Sierra Leone is the blood diamond story, is really what we're talking about, if you want to use it in a kind of a more generic term. And, I was asked to go to West Africa and particularly Sierra Leone to seek justice for the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation over 1.2 million human beings. And it was indeed an honor and a privilege to do so. But, the West African conflict and the tragedy of the civil war in Sierra Leone was really started by Muammar Gaddafi, president of Liberia, Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, and President Charles Taylor of Liberia. They were looking to create, really at the end of the day, an empire of Africa, of which Muammar Gaddafi would be the emperor. And he actually said that in 1987, 88, I think. He actually mouthed those words. So he was using West Africa first as a test case. Well, as a result of Liberia, backed by Liberian special forces and others, when they moved into the eastern portion of Sierra Leone in 1991 to seize the diamond fields of East Sierra Leone, the consequence of 10 years of that civil war that was cooked off in 1991 was just an absolute horror story. But really, at the end of the day, the conflict in Sierra Leone particularly was started in order to seize the diamond fields of Sierra Leone. In the eastern portion of that, they're alluvial diamonds. They leach to the surface, to use it to finance the rest of the revolution that would basically consume all of West Africa. As I said, the results were horrific. And so at the various peace talks, and this is important because this is an area that Paul and your wonderful organization work on, the peace accords try to stop the horror. And the Lomé peace accords did do so and stop the killing. The rebels came in to Freetown and dropped their weapons. But also during this time frame in New York, there was an effort to create some kind of accountability after President Tejan Kabad asked for some kind of court to seek justice for what had taken place in Sierra Leone. Of course, the world was a little bit skeptical at the time. There were two ad hoc tribunals, one in Rwanda and one in Yugoslavia, headed by the chief prosecutor, Carlo Del Ponte. And they weren't doing very well. They were just moving about with very little strategic plan. The problem was they also were charging or costing, over 125 to 130 million dollars each. You can certainly do the math, but $250 million a year the world was spending. It was 25% of the UN budget was being spent on justice for victims of atrocity, which, it's important to seek justice, but diplomats were starting to become very weary of all of this, to the point of where the whole idea of this during this time frame, as a footnote, the International Criminal Court is being formed at Rome, but people were really starting to step away from international justice because it just cost too much. So I was asked if I could come up with a better plan to make it a little bit more efficient and effective. And as Colin Powell told me, that was the reason the United States nominated me, and the reason that Kofi Annan agreed to go ahead and appoint me the chief prosecutor. So we were experimenting to finish out the question. We were experimenting as, could we deliver justice to victims of atrocity in a more efficient and effective way? And I'd like to think that we did.
Well, David, thinking about delivering justice, and you mentioned this briefly, the Lomé peace agreement, it took the opposite approach. The first effort to resolve the conflict in Sierra Leone was the Lomé peace agreement, and it had a number of key provisions, but one of which was a blanket amnesty. And the second was power sharing between the government and then the Revolutionary United Forces, Fonseca, including having the chief rebel leader in charge chairing the diamond exchange. So it was a traditional impunity-based, amnesty-based peace agreement. How did that work out?
Well, there was a blanket amnesty. So that was really kind of the driving cornerstone force of bringing everybody in, is because they thought that they would be free from prosecution, because they all certainly knew they had committed horrific crimes under domestic law as well as international law. And so that's what brought them in. But when they were signing, the representative from the United Nations hand wrote at the bottom saying this does not apply to international crimes. But at the time, there was nothing official as far as creating the tribunal. And so I think that the rebels thought confidently that the world would walk away from this and we would move on. So that was kind of the setting to where yours truly and a wonderful group of people came in to seek justice.
Well, David, let's talk a little bit more about the thinking of the Security Council and pivoting. So you have the UN mediating these talks, plus other key parties, power sharing. Amnesty was considered necessary to bring them in. And then the Security Council enters the fray and says, you know what? Maybe accountability, maybe justice is actually the pathway to peace, not amnesty. That's a change. Okay, there was the Yugoslav tribunal, there was the Rwanda tribunal, but as you mentioned, there was a weariness by the global community with those two tribunals. What went through the minds of the Security Council member states when they thought, we're going to put in some justice here and see how that works out?
Well, as I had mentioned, there was a plea from Tejan Kabah, president of Sierra Leone, to Kofi Annan saying, I can't handle this. This is beyond me. This is more than just some combat and warlike conflict. This is a total devastation of an entire member state of the United Nations. And I'm telling you as a footnote, Paul, it was like going into Germany at Nuremberg. I mean, when I landed, the country was 90% destroyed, no running water, no electricity, et cetera. So it was truly a horror story. And so the United States picked up the letter and took it into the Security Council and was really the driving force, with a wink and a nod from the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Netherlands. But they felt that this was a moment where one of two things were happening. If we don't do anything, that's a tragedy. If we don't do anything, then the world is going to back away from international justice, because there was truly seriously consideration that this is just costing too much. So the United States just seized the moment and was the driving force in getting Resolution 1351 passed, which called for accountability at the international level for the tragedy of Sierra Leone.
We'll come back to this later in the conversation about the future role of the United States in international criminal accountability. But I do just want to savor the moment here that, as you mentioned, it was the Americans who were the driving force with the Security Council. When we talked with Steve Rapp about the Yugoslav Tribunal, it was, the Americans who'd seconded over a dozen personnel to help the Yugoslav Tribunal get up and running. Things are a little different nowadays about the American approach.
Indeed.
To accountability. We can talk about that. But I want to stay with those early days of the tribunal. When your phone rang, and actually back in the day when this happened, your phone did ring. Now they all play movie tones or something when your phone makes a noise. But back in the days, it went ring, 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 and you picked it up. And Colin Powell, Secretary of Defense, wanted you to go to Freetown and be the first chief prosecutor. Walk us through what happened and what you were feeling, what you were thinking at that moment in time.
Well, I first got a call in August of 2001, a couple of weeks before 9/11, from a National Security Council asking me whether, I think it was Richard Haas, to be honest with you, but he called and asked whether I might be interested in being the U.S. nominee to this new court that they're thinking of putting together. And this was at 7:00 at night. I was getting ready to sit down, and I was a little bit angry about it, because it's a rare thing that my wife in that crazy town called D.C., where everybody works, it was a rare opportunity for us to both have dinner together. And so I thought it was, back in those days, we had things fixed to the walls called telephones. And about 7:00, it usually was somebody trying to sell a credit card to me. And so when I picked it up, I very curtly said, yes. And it kind of took the person calling from the National Security Council at the White House going, sir, this is Richard Haas. May I just spend a couple of minutes? I have a question to ask you. And he said, really quickly, would you be interested in being our nominee? And I said, well, I might be. But I said, is this a throwaway nomination? Because, the United States, being one of the world leaders, they nominate people just so they can nominate people, so that they show, quote, interest in the effort. And of course, there's no hope of anybody being picked for that. And so he said, no, we're serious about this. And he said, I just want to know whether you're interested so we can start forward. Well, I kind of flippantly said yes. I walked back to the dining room table where my wife was putting dinner on the table. Who was that? I said, who it was. And she just laughed, and she goes, you're not going to get that. And I said, I know. And she says, you're a Democrat. And I said, I know. This is the Bush administration. And of course, the world is angry at the world. That summer, the world had pulled out of the ICC practically, for all intents and purposes, with the famous Bolton letter. And so they just weren't going to, Americans were bad guys of the world. And of course, the planes went into the buildings, and I promptly forgot. My wife and I were both seniors in the Department of Defense. We were at war. And so I forgot about it. And about 3 weeks after 9/11 happened, I get another call from Pierre Prosper, the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes, asking me if I was still interested. And I said, you guys were serious about that? I said, I'm busy. I got things I've got to do in the Department of Defense. And he says, would you mind sending your resume over? We need to put the package together. So off that went, and my package went up to the United Nations. And then for a period of 6 months, I was called up to the UN and yelled at, insulted, and told that you're never going to get this. What right do you have to be a prosecutor, et cetera, et cetera. Though I got to know the process of the United Nations and how Byzantine its administrative process works. Then I was told about a week before the other phone call, I was told that it was going to be another very important. There were only two candidates, myself and an Australian, and he was the favorite and would probably get it. And so that I was not going to get it. So I put the file in my file drawer. Back in those days, we had paper file drawers. And I forgot about it, told my wife, I'm not going to get it. I was just told that. And then a week later, I get this phone call from the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs saying, do you know anything about this? I said, what? And he goes, well, there's a Reuters note that says that an American has been chosen as the chief prosecutor of this new international tribunal. And he goes, is that you? And I go, I don't know. I was told I wasn't going to get it. So I called Pierre Prosper's office, and he said he didn't know anything about it. And so I hang up and I'm scratching my head, and then my secretary comes in and her eyes are like wide. She goes, "Kofi Annan is on the line." I said, "Well, please send him in. I hope I'm not giving you too much detail and making this too long. But the point is, I think it's interesting for our listeners to understand how this really happens. It's not very formal. It just kind of stumbles along for a period of time. And so he says, he introduces himself, and he goes, "I was wondering if you could help me sort things out in West Africa, and I'd love for you to be part of that as the chief prosecutor." What am I going to say? No. So I gulped and said, "It'd be my pleasure, Mr. Secretary General." And he goes, "Well, good." He goes, "I'm going to announce it in a half hour," and hung up. And so I went, "Holy cow." So I called my wife, and she was not particularly happy about that. Frankly, in my gut, I really wasn't at first either. I called State Department again. I heard the phone drop to the floor and someone was running down the hall to tell Colin Powell. I called back the Secretary of Defense's office, informing them just so that they wouldn't be caught flat-footed when it hits the world stage at noon on the 19th of April of 2002. And then I landed in Freetown on August 7th of 2002, and the rest is history.
Well, David, when you landed in Freetown, on one hand, you have the Security Council resolution creating the tribunal. On the other hand, you have the Lomé Peace Agreement, which had granted amnesty. And then there was the annotation by the UN mediator saying, not really, just kidding. How did that impact your thinking about what you were going to do on day one? And at those formative stages, what were you thinking about peace with justice, peace versus justice, how the two of them relate together?
Well, peace and justice and the concept, of course, I've already mentioned that when you're putting together a strategic plan plus a prosecution plan, we have to factor in the politics, the diplomacy, the practical aspects, the legal, obviously, but also the cultural impact. Before I had actually left for Freetown, I had put together in early April a 10-phase strategic plan of how I was going to create the court, prosecute, and end the court, and brief that at the U.S. Institute of Peace to various constituents on the 24th of April of 2002, where I first met Bill Shabas, who was also going over to Freetown to be a commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And just briefed them on, here's my plan. And people were shocked because it had never been done before in the history of the United Nations related to international justice. I could show them what I was doing, when I was going to do, and why I was going to do it, and how much it was going to cost, and what I would need at various phases. When I left for Freetown, I was actually in phase 3 of that 10-phase plan. And so I was already well into putting, everything together. But the key being is that you have to be humble. You have to take in all of the constituencies. Many people were there, a lot of NGOs, all seeking some type of justice for the victims, but also just to create a peace. Now, it's also important to understand the world's largest peacekeeping force under Chapter 7. So it was an attack force. It was keep the peace. If you have to kill people to do it, keep the peace. There were 17,000 infantry, armor, attack helicopters, as well as, of course, a large headquarters, also working on peace as well and keeping the parties together. But that was the atmosphere when I came. And when I landed, I remember stepping off the airplane. It was the first commercial flight into Freetown in years. It was SN Brussels. And I remember stepping off the plane into a totally bombed out airport. Lungi Airport largely didn't exist. So that's when I stepped in. But again, I'd already sent an advance party. We had a bombed out home as our headquarters, as well as where we were going to live. And we began working our way through the process of step 3 of our 10-phase plan. But peace was very important because we had to have a stability there that allowed us to go to work every day. If you have people shooting at each other or people trying to kill you, it becomes very, very problematic. So the key to the beginning of a successful tribunal, and I think this is really kind of a key point for today, is that you have to have a peace, even though it's tenuous, you have to have a peace where both parties aren't shooting at each other and an agreement to lay down their arms before a justice mechanism can come in. Now, we were actually at the crime scene. It was just like Nuremberg in 1945. I mean, we weren't in The Hague, or we weren't in Arusha. We were right there. There were dead bodies lying in the ditches. Like I said, it was a horror story. We had no running water. Fortunately, it was a rainy season, so we would literally shower in the rain. I had no furniture or anything. I had a card table and 4 folding chairs in my office, and a cot up in my bedroom for the first 30 days before things started to arrive. But again, there was at least an agreed peace which allowed us to start justice. Now, I don't want to get too far down the road of peace. It should be have peace first, then justice, or justice and peace. I think they're concurrent, to be honest with you, and they both feed off each other in various ways that allows both aspects of settling an atrocity zone in a way that is eventually there is a permanent peace.
Well, so you've landed in Freetown. You've got your card table and your folding chairs, and you're flipping through some files, and you come up with evidence to indict Hinga Norman, who is the former Minister of Defense and the head of the government's paramilitary. Chief Norman was also widely considered as the international community, or maybe even the United States, partner in peace. But you indicted him for war crimes that he had committed. How was that received?
Well, one thing is and I think this is critical in order when you have peace, you have a peace, but also you have a justice mechanism, is I created something for the first time in history called a town hall program, and we had outreach. And I walked the countryside listening to my client. I learned in law school, probably like you did, if you have a case, whether it be criminal or civil, you might want to ask your client what happened. And so I just took that basic principle that I learned at Syracuse University College of Law, and I just went out. I mean, that was part of my strategic plan, was to have an outreach program. Now, the UN was quite angry with me about this, and they refused, and they never funded the outreach program, which became the gold standard and really became world famous. It had never been done before, and frankly has never been done since. But the point was, I walked, listened to the people of Sierra Leone tell me what happened. And so I had a good sense of the people, and I walked that countryside for 3 years. So it wasn't like it was just once now and then. And I always told them, I said, don't believe what I say, believe what I do. And so throughout all of that, I had a sense from all the way up in the northern mountains of Sierra Leone down to the beaches of Pujahun. I had a sense of my client. I had a sense of the feel of the people, how open they were to both peace and justice. So and again, this was all part of my strategic plan, phase 3. And but I'm also at the same time, I also have a prosecution plan, which is which is not public. Of course, it's ethically not, you can't reveal what you're doing. But I already had listed about 24 individuals, because remember, the mandate for the special court for Sierra Leone for the first time in history was prosecute those who bear the greatest responsibility. So I actually had a workable mandate. Both Yugoslavia and Rwanda really didn't, because their mandate was to prosecute pretty much everybody. And you can't prosecute everybody. In my case, I would have had prosecuted 30,000 people or so. Where in this case, I was able to prosecute those who bore the greatest responsibility, which is very much like Nuremberg, where it was the head of the Nazi regime. And so I took that mandate, which was the first time in history handed to a chief prosecutor, and I concluded that it was very much like Nuremberg, and I went and eventually investigated, indicted, and prosecuted the heads of the 3 warring factions and Charles Taylor, but the 3 warring factions being the Civil Defense Force, which was what Hinga Norman was head of, and the sitting Minister of Interior. He arrested him at his desk. Also, the heads of the Revolutionary United Front and the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council. So when I went into Sierra Leone, as horrific as it was, I had a plan. I stuck to the plan because I needed to show that we could do this more efficiently and effectively. I stuck to my strategic plan in setting up the court with the registrar, the late Robin Vincent, but also I had a very specific prosecution plan. And we moved forward on that and hit the ground running in August of 2002. And 6 months later, we took everybody down in Operation Justice, 80% of all of the indictees, to include an indictment of President Charles Taylor, which I sealed for political reasons and unsealed it later on that year.
Okay, so you're making friends left and right, David. You're indicting the head of the Fonseca, the head of Revolutionary United Front, which I suppose the international community was okay since he had been funneling the blood diamonds and he had taken peacekeepers hostage, and in addition to all of the atrocity crimes that he committed. And then you indict the Minister of Defense, Norman Hinga, who the internationals were trying to negotiate or sort of have be a pillar of peace. And then you go and you indict the president of a neighboring country, Charles Taylor. Were you concerned that this might impact or implode the peace process? What was going through your mind as you were implementing your strategic plan in country and seeing the actual relationship and tension between peace and justice?
Well, not only in their outreach program that I'm going through, but I'm also meeting and setting up regular meetings with civil societies, the War Affected Amputee program. Plus, I am meeting and developing personal relationships with all the heads of all the NGOs and UN organizations within Sierra Leone, meeting with them on a regular basis, talking to them, getting their perspectives, showing them respect, asking for their help. But then I also was quietly traveling throughout West Africa, meeting with the heads of state of all the West African countries, their ministers of defense and their foreign ministers, talking to them about what I should do in a sense of just a generic sense. Generally, we can't talk about, really what to do because it was in the statute that I could receive no help or assistance from anybody outside of the court in this of any kind of political pressures or what have you. But just to show the respect of all of them. Here's my strategic plan in general, which is public. Nobody didn't talk to them about the prosecution plan. But the bottom line is I from heads of state in West Africa all the way down to people living way up in the mountains, just listening to them as well. And so that's, you go into these things, if you're actually physically there, with a great deal of humility and a great deal of ability to listen. And so by the time I've been in this country for 4 months, I had actually accomplished meeting with most of the heads of state. I had literally traveled the entire country of Sierra Leone. I had met with and had befriended and had regular lunch meetings with pretty much all of the civil society, victims organizations, as well as NGO and UN organizations. So I became their friend. And, you don't go in and tell them what you're doing and tell them I'm the chief prosecutor. At the end of the day, everybody knew this. I could take down a sitting head of state by statute, international statute. And so I knew that, but that's not how I approached anybody. I came in humbly asking for help. And 95% of those who I asked for help readily agreed and were very helpful through the entire time the special court was in Freetown. And like you say, it is really largely, it's been found in, looking back now, historians and academics are saying it was the most successful international prosecution. And, it was known as the little engine that could, because it was smaller, more effective, but it accomplished the very same thing. I only had 70 people in my office at any one given time, as opposed to, the prosecution office, for example, in Yugoslavia was 1,000 people. I had 70 to include clerks and everybody. And, our budget was 25 million average, sometimes $30 million a year, as opposed to $150 million. So what we did by using politics, by using a stable peace, we were able to show that, with a plan, and this is important, with a plan, you can actually accomplish international justice, atrocity accountability, efficiently and effectively. And we're doing the very same thing in setting up a multinational court in Ukraine, using the 7 steps that I have shown the world to create that particular accountability mechanism for Ukraine. So we've already done this, and we can do it again. But again, that's how you do it. You come in humble, listening, with a plan, and guess what happens? You're successful.
Now, David, you were successful in taking down the senior leadership of, again, the Revolutionary United Front, those in the government that were responsible for atrocity crimes, plus Charles Taylor, who's still serving out his sentence now in a maximum security prison north of London. Can you quantify or explain, in your opinion, the level of impact that this justice has had on peace in Sierra Leone for the last 20 years and knock on wood, what appears to be a durable peace? Was this just a nudge along the way of the pathway to peace, or this was a driving factor on the durability of peace? Just for our listeners to get a sense of how central and how important is justice to a durable peace.
Well, we had a fairly strong peace and a lot of peacekeepers when we first started, but yes, we were able to show, and many of you have already heard me say this, this is one of my key phrases that I've been saying, that I really did show the rule of law is more powerful than the rule of the gun. And the reason I know that, and the reason I know that they understand that, is because that was one of the things I told the people of Sierra Leone and West Africa, those exact words. Don't believe what I say, believe what I do. I'm telling you, the rule of law is more powerful than the rule of the gun. A stroke of my pen, just an example, I took down the most powerful warlord in Africa. And he was humbled before the law, and then he was put in jail for the rest of his life. So the people began to realize that instead of picking up an AK-47, if we stick to the rule of law, that perhaps that is what's going to bring peace, a stable peace. Because I've always, and we were lucky. We had a truth commission and a justice mechanism there in Sierra Leone. And a lot of people said there's no way that that's going to work because they're going to be fighting each other and stealing each other. And so, I did a lot of listening when I was being considered to be the chief prosecutor, as well as when I was first starting. And part of my strategic plan is to build a close relationship with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Bishop Humper, who was the chair, and I became good friends. We had lunch on a monthly basis. And we declared before the world on UN Day on 1 December of 2002, standing together, that the Truth Commission and the Special Court for Sierra Leone would work together to seek justice. And I announced to the world in July that I was not going to use any evidence that the Truth Commission was able to receive in any of my prosecutions or investigations. And I coined this term. I said, truth plus justice equals sustainable peace. Truth plus justice equals sustainable peace. And that's what has happened in Sierra Leone. We did have the Truth Commission. It finished its work. It published the truth so victims could come in and tell the truth. Combatants could come in and tell the truth and not be prosecuted for what they had said before the Truth Commission. Now, it finished its work the second year that I was there, but they did do their work, and we were never an impediment. In fact, they assisted us as well. So we showed the world that truth and justice can work. But that sustainable peace is because of both truth and justice. The victims had a chance to tell the world what happened. We were able to prosecute those who created those conditions, and that sustainable peace has been in effect since January of 2001. When the rebels came in, put down their weapons systems, special court did its work and has left. And now that country has held several elections, to include an opposition coming to power, not a shot being fired. Now, God bless Sierra Leone, which we call Salon. They've had other challenges, like the Ebola tore through that country, as well as all of West Africa. But also then, of course, COVID came in and did the same thing. But despite that, institutionally, people are looking to government for stability under the rule of law. And so this is a really, we go from blood diamonds for 10 years and the destruction of 1.2 million human beings plus 5 million in-country refugees to a country that has been at peace for, well, my goodness, we're looking at 23 years.
So, David, as you were working with the Truth Commission, deploying justice to secure this durable peace, what was going on in the minds of the diplomats? I like to say justice is a 300-pound adolescent gorilla, which sits on the pathway to peace. You, David, you were essentially that adolescent gorilla there. And the diplomats are like, yeah, we invited David to the party. We interjected justice into this peace process. Now he's indicting senior leadership. He told us what he was going to do, but he's actually doing what he told us he's going to do, which for those of our listeners who are in Washington, D.C., they're like, yeah, that's really surprising. Outside of Washington, they may think, well, of course. But you did. You told him what you were going to do. You did that. What was your interaction, your relationship with the diplomats, the peacebuilders, the political community? And what was your strategy, your personal strategy for navigating the politics of justice?
Well, you go into these situations, like I've told you humbly, but you're only one star in a universe that is trying to create a peace and maybe justice. And so if you recognize the fact that you're only one star in a galaxy, then that helps as far as when you approach diplomats. And that was part of my strategic plan, is develop professional and personal relationships with the diplomatic corps of not only Sierra Leone, but also the region. And so I went to a lot of parties, drank a lot of gin and tonics, in some cases vodka or what have you, and some things I drank that I didn't recognize. But I have to tell you, I was personal friends with every member of the diplomatic corps. And even so much so was when I was getting ready to leave in July of 2005, 80% of the special court's work was largely done. They held a gala for me, hosted by the Egyptian ambassador. And it was a very moving and a lot of toasts and stuff. But it just occurred to me that they were doing it not because they had to do it. They were just saying goodbye to a friend. And I'm still friends with some of them. The only ambassador that I never got along with, but after he was replaced, I did, was the United States ambassador, to the point of he was so obstructionist as far as our work. I went to Washington, went to the Senate, complained about the U.S. ambassador, complained to the State Department about the U.S. ambassador, but the African division was very skeptical of what I was doing. But the point is that he was removed, and we had a much better ambassador, and he was still a little bit skeptical, because by this time I've already taken down President Charles Taylor, who was a friend of the United States. In fact, he was their man in Havana. He was an asset of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and his case officer was in the White House. And so he was kind of their man in Havana. And even though the statute said I could prosecute a head of state, they really didn't believe that actually I did. So the only flashpoint, but I took great care, and I don't want to go into too much detail on this. The only flashpoint, particularly from the United States point of view, is when I publicly unsealed the indictment of President Charles Taylor on the 3rd of June of 2003, as he was walking up the steps in Ghana for settling the peace in Liberia, knowing full well that he didn't intend to do that. And I decided to strip him of all of his political power in front of the world while he was walking into the peace agreement meeting in Ghana. But I had already informed all the key constituents related to this, UN, US, UK, Ghana, and said in the next 24 hours, a significant national security event is about to happen. I informed the president and the foreign minister of Ghana an hour before I unsealed the indictment. I also informed the president of Sierra Leone, the secretary general of the United Nations, as well as the ambassadors for the United Kingdom, as well as the United States, saying that I am unsealing the indictment of Charles Taylor in an hour. And exactly at the stroke of 11, as I was told, because we had assets in place in Ghana saying he's walking up the steps, I held a press conference. The room was filled with international, regional, and local newsmen. And I announced to the world that President Charles Taylor is an indictee and changed history.
Did the diplomats ever anticipate that you would change history when they created the tribunal in 2001?
No, I don't think so. I think they because they kind of understood that there were heads of state that really cooked this thing off. And I've already alluded to the fact there were three. And this is where politics comes in. I had the possibility of indicting three heads of state, and the two that I didn't actually were very much involved. But I politically decided the world was not ready for three heads of state to be indicted by an international tribunal. I think that would have been politically too much, and they might have closed the court. And so I chose the person who had the most culpability, and that was the head of state right next door to Sierra Leone, and that was President Charles Taylor. And he was obviously culpable, and eventually, on my indictment, found guilty of aiding and abetting the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation of over 1.2 million people, where he was given a 50-year sentence and carted off to His Majesty's maximum security prison in England.
David, you talked a little bit about the politics, the political calculation. One of the big debates in the peace negotiations that I've been involved in is, an amnesty-based peace agreement or an accountability-based peace agreement? Now, and again, we've worked with at PLPG governments, self-determination movements, non-state armed actors, civil society. So pick any configuration you want of our clients. They're either on the we need amnesty or they're on we need accountability. But in your opinion, is there ever a role for amnesty in today's world in peace agreements?
It is a tool in a kit bag of options. It's just what is the political interest of the international community, the region, and domestically as to how they want to solve the problem. Usually it's a conflict. I call them dirty little wars of the 21st century. Usually there are victims, and usually it's civilians, and most likely it's mainly women and children who pay the terrible price. That's why the cornerstones of all my indictments were gender crimes for the first time in history. So you have these situations, and if there's anybody that knows that better than anybody, it's you, Paul. So you look to your kit bag, considering seriously what the parties intend to finish this. How do they plan to finish it? And you use these tools to include amnesty in a way that temporarily perhaps stops something, temporarily causes parties to back away. And I'm talking about amnesty, temporarily allows a breathing space for future discussions. But at the end of the day, you can't amnesty away international crimes. That's a slippery slope that we will regret in the near term and future related to accountability. But again, amnesties are useful at appropriate times, but to permanently put an amnesty in where those who are culpable will walk and not be held accountable is no good for the victims. It continues the destabilization. The wound never heals, Paul. The wound never heals. In Sierra Leone, it has healed. They have challenges, but that terrible wound has healed. So again, amnesty does not heal anything. It just gives the perception of peace, which at the end of the day will never be totally there, a sustainable peace, if you have amnesty. But again, that's my perspective, but that's my considered perspective related to seeking peace in these dirty little wars.
Well, David, just two more questions because you've been so generous with your time today. My penultimate question is, you've been heavily engaged since your time as the prosecutor for Sierra Leone in seeking to establish mechanisms for accountability in Syria, mechanisms for accountability in Yemen and Ukraine most recently. What are your thoughts as to whether or not the model of the Sierra Leone Tribunal could be applicable in these other conflicts, and the necessity for a role of justice in ending those conflicts and building a durable peace?
Well, the question is, can we do this? The question is it something that'll be efficient? And so the model of the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone is a very viable model. We put together a package that created a special UN General Assembly-backed special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression, to include a model statute and to include a UN General Assembly resolution. That package was submitted to the UN as well as President Zelensky, who essentially bought off on the idea back in September of 2022, which got me sanctioned by the Russian Federation. That's another story. But so we had the model, the very same people that helped me put the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone model together. Erwin Kotler, the former Minister of Justice of Canada, Hans Corell, who is the father of all of the modern tribunals, as well as David Sheffer, who started the process of creating the Special Court for Sierra Leone, Richard Goldstone, the first international prosecutor since Nuremberg, and myself, took what we learned from West Africa and shaped and molded it into a very workable and very practical model. In fact, what I did is I took that package and created the 7 steps for creating a special tribunal. But because of the challenges of politics, that is no longer still on the table, but no longer a politically viable model. And so we put together what we call the multinational court for Ukraine and the crime of aggression, whereas the UN General Assembly does not the the mechanism together, but it is a group of member states of the UN come together and do that. And that statute is being tabled in 28 June before the core group of nations as an alternative to some other ideas. And that's where now. But again, what you have to do is you have to show the world we've done this before. We have actually taken down a sitting head of state, successfully prosecuted him, and I am trying to tell the world, along with my colleagues and many others now, that we've done this before. We can do it again. We don't have to reinvent anything. The jurisprudence is there to include the concept of taking down a head of state. An international tribunal can do so based on U.S. versus Prosecutor versus Taylor, that any head of state who commits international crimes while as head of state is not immune from those actions. And so I was much surprised that they had forgotten the fact that we've done this before. And so that has helped us and sustained us and allows us to argue that this is not something that is out of the ordinary, but just something we're dusting off and putting into effect again. So that's where we are related to all of this. I may have drifted a little bit, Paul, but anyway, there it is.
No, that gives a good sense, David, that when we're looking at Yemen, Syria, Ukraine, oftentimes the international community is perplexed, confused, cognitive dissonance. We've done this before. We've created tribunals. We've created tribunals before. You've indicted, prosecuted heads of state, senior leadership. It can be done. It was done over 2 decades ago. Which brings me to my last question, the takeaway question. David, you've been working for nearly 3 decades on holding individuals responsible for the commission of atrocity crimes. What is the one thing that you want our listeners to take away and remember from this conversation about the interplay between justice and a lasting, durable peace?
That peace and justice work hand in hand, not in opposition of each other, and that tends to be thrown away that way. You should approach peace and justice together to create a circumstance by which a nation or a region can be better for it and to move forward in a way that they can live in peace and freedom. So that the takeaway really is that peace and justice are important in a sustainable peace so that an atrocity zone can heal and move forward.
Well, David, I wanted to thank you for taking the time, being so generous with your time. It's been an honor and a privilege to not only have this conversation with you, but to have known you for the last 2 decades. And I'm always inspired by your dedication to learn the lessons of your experience, share those lessons. You're always there front and center, making the case for accountability. And so I'm inspired by that. And it definitely impacts the work that I try to do. So thank you, David, for taking your time and for having this conversation, for all that you do to promote accountability for atrocity crimes.
It's my pleasure, and I'm glad I'm able to continue to fight the fight and stamp down the beast of impunity. But PLIPG is also in the forefront, and I'm honored to be a senior peace fellow with PLIPG, and I applaud you and all your team and the work they do around the world as well. Together, we can seek justice and make for a better world.
Well, thank you, David.